and we have 4 panelists. I will introduce them on stage. First up, we have Mr. Srikumar Menon. Dr. Srikumar Menon is an architect and researcher who specializes in ancient Indian architecture. He's currently an associate professor at NIAS. His work explores megaliths, stupas, and temples with a focus on astronomical alignments. He's a Homi Bhabha Fellow and author. He investigates early construction techniques and India's architectural evolution across historic periods. Next, we have V Selvakumar. Dr. Selvakumar is the head of maritime history and marine archaeology at Tamil University, specializes in Indian archaeology, maritime history, and heritage management. A former faculty at Kerala Center for Heritage Studies, he has conducted extensive archaeological research, including digs at Arikamedu, which is very, very famous now, I think, in the public consciousness, Pattanam, and Kodumanai, exploring India's rich cultural and maritime past. We have Ravi Korisettar. Professor Ravi Korisettar is a leading Indian Paleolithic archaeologist who specializes in geoarchaeology and human-environment interactions. Retired from Karnataka University, he has held prestigious fellowships and is currently an adjunct professor at NIAS, Bengaluru. With 11 books and 100+ research articles, his work has significantly shaped Indian archaeology. Finally, we have Disha Ahluwalia, who is an archaeologist specializing in field archaeology and ancient ceramics. Pursuing a PhD at MSU Baroda, she studies the Ghaggar Basin's landscape. She has worked at major proto-historic sites like Binjore, Sinoli, and Rakhigadi. She also writes for the print and curates Confessions of an Archaeologist. Hand over the panel to Disha to uncover the confessions of other archaeologists. And before that, let me invite Professor Rakesh Vasan to welcome our speakers with stones.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So basically, when we talk about archaeology, we have a very vague idea in general, public, like people have a very vague idea what archaeology really entails. Now, as archaeologists, we do deal with a lot of material remains, pottery and bones and other artifacts, but while dealing with these, we dive into a very unknown world, which takes us thousands of years in antiquity. Although I don't agree with a lot of things which Sir Mortimer Wheeler has said about in the past, but I do agree with this statement. Archaeology is a science that must be lived, must be seasoned with humanity. Dead archaeology is the driest dust that blows. It simply put, it really tries to tell us archaeologists that we need to go beyond the laundry list of antiquities, go beyond the numbers that we keep tabulating, in our sheets. So in this session, we'll be talking about an aspect of archaeology which is very regional to southern India. When we talk about archaeology in public domain, other aspects of archaeology or our past really overshadow. We don't get to hear about the regional, non-linear aspect of archaeology, the regional colors, the regional imprints that we find in material remain. So in this session, we'll dive into the world of archaeology with the lens of looking at the regional distribution of materials, especially the megaliths. The structures which amaze me, and I'm sure after the session they will amaze you as well. So can you... Sorry. So the journey, the story sort of this, to stones and manganese basically starts with this man right here, Robert Bruce Foote. He was the one who first found the hand axe. This is a representational image. This is not the hand axe he has found. But with one discovery, he was able to tell the world that, look, in India, in the subcontinent, there is a past which goes back to millions and millions of years. It's not that, it's not very recent, and it really goes into prehistory, because this was a time simultaneously where in other parts of the Europe, similar findings and discoveries were being made. And interestingly, so you can see this is an hand axe. Professor Korisettar had just got this hand axe somewhere from Africa. And these are the kind of stone tools we get in prehistoric context. So for you, if you just find them randomly without even knowing that they are tools, you would think they're just, broken, fragments of stones or anything. But when, as an archaeologist, we look at them, instantly we know that they are worked by humans, worked by our ancestors, and they are precious. The point that I wanted to make and stress today was, and we will talk about this, we have experts who have worked for decades in this field, is that this right here is the chart, is the tabulation sort of given to us, that this is how our culture progresses. It goes from Paleolithic to Mesolithic, and Mesolithic means it has microliths, and you can see imagery of microliths. So these small, tiny fragments, these are the tools. So you can see how the evolution of cell phones have happened from big, gigantic phones to smaller, more efficient phones. So similarly, the stone toolkit has also evolved. And then the Neolithic is a stage where farming begins and sedentary life begins. And then there comes of the age of metals, copper and iron. So this was a generic chronocultural sequence in our terminology, in our technical terms, was given to us, handed to us. But now what we know, that it's not true at all. Every region of this country, the subcontinent, gives us new data, tells us that there are certain aspects, there's certain periods which overlap. There is no linear progression at all. And that is a very case with southern India, and what we're going to be talking about, this journey from Stone Age right across to megaliths, which are these big stone monuments. I will start with you, Professor Korisettar, because you've largely worked with prehistoric, period. You worked with Neolithic and various sites, including Sangakalu, which is on the screen here. So could you just enlighten us about this journey of stones and humans in the early period?
Thank you. Before I answer her, I have further carry forward the first two slides. Yeah. That is Wheeler's statements. He made another drastic statement that archaeology deals with stones and more stones. Yeah. But since this statement made by Wheeler, archaeology has become more and more interdisciplinary. And he also, at one point of time, had to confess that yes, archaeology is an interdisciplinary science. So in response to what he said 50 years ago, or more than 50 years ago, I recently brought out 3 volumes in response to Wheeler's statement, yeah, that is Beyond Stones and More Stones. So these books were published by the Mythic Society in Bangalore. They deal with the kind of story she was trying to narrate, beginning with the earliest evidence of human presence in the subcontinent and how they developed through represented by various types of tools and so on. Another is Robert Brucewood. We regard him as a father of Indian prehistory because he was the first person to identify the earliest Paleolithic settlement in India. And it happens to be in southern India, and it is now submerged or lost in the city of Madras. That is a place called Pallavaram. And it was discovered in 1863. And then in 1866, he published the first scientific article on his findings, and that heralded the beginning of prehistoric archaeology in India. It's not only that, this major part of this region was under Madras presidency, and he was working for the British Geological Survey. And before he was appointed as a geologist in this particular institution, he had exposure to Darwin's theory of evolution, that debates were going on in the Royal Society. And everyone was looking towards India for identifying origins of mankind, as well as origins of civilization. So this was in the back of his mind. So when he began his surveys as a geologist and preparing maps, he was the one who was entering into the inland regions. And that is where he was able to identify because he had seen some of those stone tools which he was showing at the beginning near Madras for the first time. And then it took 3 years for him to convince himself that they represent human presence in this area. Because if you want to convince people and the academic community, you have to have a solid evidence and also a proper scientific understanding of what you have found. So in that context, it took 3 years, and during this period, he found more sites where similar kind of stone tools were found. And that is where he was successful in establishing the prehistoric beginnings in the Indian subcontinent, and all that began in southern India. And since then, wherever he was doing his geological surveys, he began to identify sites of various categories. So not only the hand axes and cleavers of the early Paleolithic, but later period sites represented by microliths, then represented by polystone stone tools and various types of sites and burial sites and things like that. And then at the end of about 40 years, he had collected artifacts, kind of antiquities we have identified from nearly 450 sites. He prepared an excellent catalog and sold all his material to the Madras Government Museum, which are on display there. So they tell the story of mankind in the Indian subcontinent. So that is one reason why we regard him as father of Indian prehistory. And in order to perpetuate his memory and also continue to carry forward the legacy, I have established a museum in Bellary town named after Robert Brucewood. It is called Robert Brucewood Sanganakalu Archaeological Museum. It's 3 segments in the title of the museum is Robert Brucewood and then Sanganakalu. This is a Neolithic site where the earliest village settlements came into existence in southern part of India. And he was the first person to identify that site as a Neolithic site, as well as a site where large-scale production of polystone axes were manufactured. And that credit goes to him. And then several archaeologists, before independence and after independence, have been working at many of these sites which were first reported by him. And that has established firmly the way in which his story of the Indian subcontinent begins. In simple words, the history of mankind begins with the stone chip, because when you produce an artifact or a tool or an implement, you have to modify the natural piece of stone into a well-defined shape or morphology, and that has a certain function to perform. So in order to achieve this, you have to do this chipping with the help of a stone hammer. And from stone chip to the electronic chip today, the human history has developed dramatically, more so in the last several centuries, that post-industrial revolution, changes have taken place. Human society has advanced to such a great extent, and we are not looking back. But even we are now finding it to look forward as well. There are certain, activities of present-day society which may make our future much more insecure and so on. But leaving aside, your question, will you repeat once again?
If you can stress on Sangakalu and the early farming, we've spoken about prehistory.
Yes.
And see, the reason why I wanted to talk about Sangakalu is that I shown Robert Brucewood's photo and hand axe. In 1863, I think, if I'm right with the date, he also found hand axe at Athirapakkam.
Pallavaram.
Yeah,
but slightly later at Athirapakkam.
Athirapakkam.
Yes.
And that site is today dated to about 1.5 million years?
1.7 million years, 70 lakh years ago.
Million. So that's one of the earliest dated
So
Paleolithic
that is the most successful
site.
way of carrying forward the legacy left behind by Robert Brucewood. Even today, investigations are going on at many of the sites which were discovered by him. And Athirapakkam stands the best example of...
it's in Tamil Nadu.
It is slightly north of Chennai, not very far from Chennai. But that was also discovered by Foote and his colleague, William King. But present-day research has gone truly multidisciplinary. And for a long time, we did not have a date for the earliest settlement. We were identifying these sites on the basis of the type of stone tools. So the kind of stone tool which she stored is the early Paleolithic stone tool. We call it a hand axe. It has a triangular morphology. It has a pointed tip and a rounded butt. And the sides are also very sharp. So these are called large cutting tools. So these were the ones which facilitated early Paleolithic and the Paleolithic communities to procure food. But the site she is talking about is the Sanganakalu, which represents a stage when man had already become an agriculturist.
Yeah.
So the type of stone tools that were required for making or producing food were very, very different compared to the ones which were first discovered by Robert Brucefoot. The same Robert Brucefoot was responsible for discovering this Neolithic site called Sanganakalu. It's not the only site that we know. There are nearly 1,400 sites distributed across Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, northern Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and southern part of Maharashtra. And several of them, nearly 30 to 40 sites, have been systematically excavated. Like we did not have a chronology for the early Paleolithic for a very, very long time. After Athirumpakkam was dated, we now know that the earliest settlements go back to 1.7 million years to 1.5 million years. Similarly, there is one more site in India which was discovered by, early work was also carried out by Robert Brucefoot in that area. And that is what is the region known as the Bhima Basin in northern Karnataka. And an area called Shorapur Doab, that is the land between the Krishna River and the Bhima River. Professor Padaya of Deccan College has been working there. He was working there for several decades. And of course, he is now a retired professor. During the third decade of his investigations in the Shorapur Doab, he encountered a site called Isampur. At the first instance, he just thought that it is one another site among the 400 sites he had discovered in this area. But when he revisited the site in 1996, it turned out one of the oldest Paleolithic quarry site. Quarry in the sense, the raw material, lithic raw material, the rock which is exposed in the region was utilized. In the sense, it was quarried out from the exposed beds, and the artifacts were manufactured right at the place. So this could be delineated on the basis of the way in which the waste products of making an hand axe were also lying along with the finished hand axe and so on. And in addition to that, these hand axes and flakes were also associated with animal fossils. Unfortunately, we still do not have a human fossil evidence coming from any of these early Paleolithic sites. So this particular site was dated to 1.2 million years ago, as early as 2001 or 2002. But he was not very sure. Like food, when he first discovered in 1863, he was not sure what it was. But then when he began to find more of them, in 1866, he was very comfortable in publishing it. Similarly, when Athirumpakkam was published, 1.7 million year date was published for Athirumpakkam, Professor Padaya's work also got much more strength, and he began to publish them in more peer-reviewed journals and so on. That is where we know now that in southern India, we have earliest settlements going back to what we call lower Pleistocene, or in the time range from about 2 million years to at least 140,000 years. It's a very long time span for the early Paleolithic in India. And then this early Paleolithic is succeeded by what we call middle Paleolithic, and then the upper Paleolithic. And the kind of small flake tools she was showing as microliths, they now range in time from about 40,000 years ago onwards. Otherwise, they were thought to be only 10,000 years or so. So that is what is Mesolithic period, the transition between hunting, gathering, and early agricultural way of life. So there are a large number of Mesolithic sites across the Indian subcontinent. And in southern India also there are many. And recently we have also discovered caves in interior Karnataka where we get similar type of stone tools. In fact, that photograph belongs to the site which is located in the Sandur forest area in the Bellary district of Karnataka. And they are likely to be as old as 30 to 40,000 years. But we are yet waiting for the chronometric date, which has now been being analyzed at the Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleosciences in Lucknow. So we are very eager to announce the age of these microliths. But this transition is reflected not only in the type of stone tools they were making, and there is a gradual transition in the transformation in the shape of tools, and this transformation was necessitated by changing life ways. So hunting gathering to gathering wild plant food resources to digging in the earth to extract tubers and so on, and also using large cutting tools for splitting bones and extracting marrow and so. So that was also facilitating biological evolution as well as adaptive mechanisms were also on the increase. So when during the last 10,000 years, the environment on the earth changed drastically, the end of the ice age, there were these grasslands emerging in different parts of India. And these grasslands were also containing varieties of grasses yielding wild millets, pulses, and cereals, and so on. These were not known to the Paleolithic people. So during the Mesolithic period, this transition and identification of these grasses containing suitable wild grains were identified by these hunter-gatherers, and that is where, in order to harvest wild food grains, they required these small tools. We call them microliths. So they were not used individually, but they were hafted and then used for cutting grasses, harvesting wild grains, and so on. And that laid the basis for agricultural way of life. In the sense, they were not simply harvesting wild grasses, but they began to now pick up these grains, wild food grains, and cultivate. So it is a process. Cultivation is a process. Prepare the land, cultivate, till the land, sow the seed, and then weeding, etc. And then the onset of monsoon or whatever seasonal conditions favorable for the growth of these grasses were already known to these people. And that transition takes place at different points of time in different parts of Indian subcontinent. India being the very west subcontinent, we have regional variation in the way in which this transition took place. And we also see regional variation in the way in which different food crops were first cultivated. So for example, if you go to northwestern part where we have the Indus Valley civilization sites, we have cereals, Southwest Asian cereals. They are called wheat and barley were the staple food crops which are cultivated. And then they started domesticating some of these animals like sheep and goat and cattle and so on. So whether these are part of the native environment, local environment, or they were introduced from outside. This became an issue amongst archaeologists to identify the processes of transition from hunting gathering to agricultural way of life. If you go to the northwestern part of the subcontinent, the transition began as early as 9,000 years ago. So this regional variation in the way in which transition took place is also well documented by archaeologists. But when it comes to southern India, the oldest transition that took place from hunting gathering to agricultural way of life does not seem to be older than about 5,300 or 5,500 years ago or so. So most comfortably, we place the beginning of this agricultural way of life, the emergence of village settlements, and then adoption of local millet crops. So it's not that only cereals which were introduced or first cultivated in the northwest were cultivated all over India. So these hunter-gatherers were familiar with the regional environment and the local food resources in terms of wild food grains or grasses yielding pulses and millets and cereals and so on. So this transition in southern India took place around 3000 BC or so. Until then, this region was mostly covered by what we call Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and so on. So they have a long survival in depending upon the environment in which they were living and also the need of the community which were well adapted to these environments and so on. So this transition beginning to the Neolithic is characterized by the emergence of first village settlements and the first cultivation of local millets in terms of what we call small millets which are native to this area. We technically call them Brachiaria ramosa. In Kannada it is called Korolu. And then we have Setaria variety of another millet and two pulses, horse gram and green gram, which are native to different sectors of the southern peninsula. So they were able to identify them, initially harvest them in wild form, and then cultivate them and then develop domesticated varieties. All the food crops that we are consuming today are domesticated varieties. So there is a morphological difference between wild and domesticated food crops. So this change in the morphology of the grains is traced by specialists known as archaeobotanists. So you cannot talk about Neolithic beginnings or Neolithic agricultural way of life without knowing what food crops they were cultivating. And for a long time, we were only basing ourselves in terms of typology and technology of making stone tools. So paleoliths were very crude, massive, large, and so on, with very, very thick cross-section. Whereas here, these were made from an entirely different rock and very fine-grained rock, which occurs in different geological formations here. And that particular rock known as dolerite was the most preferred one. And it was easy for polishing them with a smooth surface. And these were the ones which were facilitating agricultural activity and including butchering, goat, sheep, and so on. And in addition to that, you could even split the bones to extract marrow. And the domestication was of both plants and animals. So a package of sheep, goat, and which are not native to this subcontinent. They were introduced from the northwest and domesticated here. And this domestication is not local again, because pastoral way of life was also introduced into southern India. So all this story is very well established based on excavations and analysis of material cultural remains. But then we have now biological material coming from archaeological sites in the form of these food grains which were cultivated. They don't occur in the primary form, they occur in secondary form, because when food grains were processed, some of them were roasted, and the roasted grains develop carbon coat. And this carbon coat is a shell for the grain, and that helps in preserving it for thousands and thousands of years. So it's like a shell. So such charred grains could be recovered from these village settlement sites and identify them. And so these food grains were identified, and that is an area called archaeobotany. And then we have archaeozoologists, animal remains coming from archaeological context, identify which were domesticated ones and which were wild hunted game animals and so on. So this is the most essential requirement to understand the life phase of the Neolithic people. So, and then in the post-1950s, we began to apply the radiocarbon dating method. Was very well developed by about 1950s, and since then somehow these sites which were excavated before the emergence of availability of radiocarbon dating, and those which were also excavated post the development of radiocarbon dating, were reinvestigated and subject to dating. So as a result of that, we have good chronological control. So the Neolithic begins here around 3000 BC very comfortably, and develops during the period of about 1200 years, from 3000 BC to 1200 BC. What we see is not only early stages were characterized by the cultivation of local millets and pulses. Over a period of time, continuous migrations that were taking place from different parts, from north to south and south to north. These food crops also get introduced. Along with that, some of the languages also get introduced. So these migrations played a very important role in transforming the life phase and also giving a character to the life phase of the people at a particular period of time. And then, of course, the later part will be dealt with by my colleagues here. But this Neolithic begins around 3000 BC, maybe couple of hundred years earlier, but then it transitions into what we call Iron Age, which is the age where the iron ore was identified, metallurgical methods were developed or invented, and iron was extracted, and iron objects came to be produced in replacing stone. But it did not completely replace stone artifacts, but gradually over a period of time, copper, iron begin to appear in these archaeological contexts, and then they enter into metal age. So these transitions have been taking place in some areas much more rapidly, in some areas much more tardily. So this variation in the way in which these transitions were taking place have also been identified. But overall, what we can definitely say that well-established village agricultural economies characterized by domestication of animals as well as food crops came into existence by about 3000 BC, yeah, and gradually established the Iron Age around 1400 BC. Yeah.
So you can see that we've covered a large base from 1.7 million to about 1200 BC. It's quite a large time frame to cover in like 15-20 minutes. But between the Neolithic and Iron Age is where this hero of the story lies, the megaliths. They lie somewhere there and continue within the Iron Age, and which is a very interesting aspect. And I'm going to hand over to you, Professor, to sort of take us forward into the storyline.
Yeah, thank you, Disha. I would like to thank the organizers and Disha for inviting me to this panel. One of the important work that archaeologists undertake is the field survey. What we call as village-to-village survey. Actually, India's history lies in the villages. We say that only if India's history can be perfect only when visit each and every village and reconstruct the archaeological record. Since we are busy with the teaching, we go for these kind of field work, sometime for a period of 2 weeks, sometime for 1 or 2 days whenever we get opportunity. That is how I visited this Noyal River Valley west of Coimbatore town. So when people invite me for lectures like that, I take one extra day and stay there, and then whatever the resources we get, we spend for field work. So archaeologists use different strategies for field work. Sometimes they use remote sensing map, aerial maps. Nowadays we use Google Maps and also village to village survey. Village to village survey is very interesting because we get a chance to visit very remote villages. We go to the village, go to a tea shop, and then we engage a conversation with the tea shop owner. We just have a cup of tea, and then we talk to the people, mainly the laborers and workers, because it's very important to talk to these people who know the nook and corner of the village and the landscape. We basically tap the knowledge of the public about the micro landscape of the village. We ask them if there are any potsherd, if there are any temples, if there are any other springs and all that. So when I visited the village of Molapalayam, when I gave a lecture at Coimbatore, we went up where there is a Sirvani waterfalls, and this Noyal river is very important. This river, on this river only, we have this site of Kodumanal, early historic site located. So we went to the village, and before that we searched the Google map, and we found a temple called the Karuparayan temple, where there is also very interesting water spring. This water spring comes down to this Noyal river as two branches. This Neolithic site was located in between the two branches. In archaeology, we call this as a purposive technique, where we look at the geographic pattern, the landscape, how the hills are there. If you look at this area, you can see it is surrounded by hills on all three sides. It's a very typical context, similar to what we are finding in other parts of Karnataka. So we had a gut feeling that that should be something. And there is also a Irula tribal settlement, and there is a water spring, and which they are using it even till today. During our second season camp in 2024, we were drinking that water. It was very good. In the 2021 season, we were buying water for 15,000. In the second season, we were using the natural water source. We could save. More than that, the water was very healthy. And this is the drone map of that area. You can see the ash deposits here. See, normally we identify sites based on the soil mark, on the crop marks. So if there is a change in color, you can identify that. Here you can see the ash deposits. Is there, yeah, can you pass
Pointer is
that?
not there, but you can stand and show.
No, I can, I want to show the next slide.
Next.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, this is a skeleton. Actually, we excavated this site. We found skeleton, archaeobotanical remains, and also zoological remains and shell beads. Very interestingly, this belongs to middle-aged lady, around 40 years old, and we found, a very important shell artifact. Actually, Oliva sp shell bead along with this burial. We also found two other burials along with that, 6 to 7 year old baby and 3 year old baby. And we also found a lot of stone artifact. Typically these pointed stone axe and these kind of spheroids and rubbing stones, querns, and burnished ceramics. We found a whole range of artifacts. We also found, I don't know whether that image is here, we also found very interestingly a shell pendant made of lamellidans, and it was in the shape of a fish, and we could understand the aesthetic nature of these people. So we are talking about this region around 1600 BCE to 1200 BCE, which is the late phase of the Southern Neolithic culture. Southern Neolithic culture is a very important cultural region in India. When we talk about Indian history, we give too much importance to Indus civilization, whereas we completely ignore other cultures. If you look at Kashmir and also Ganga Valley, Central India, and Deccan Chalcolithic and Southern Neolithic, we have contemporary people living all across. This is what I call as sometime as part of subaltern archaeology, where we need to look at the marginal landscape. We focus on civilization and all those glorious phases based on our nationalistic understanding. So when I started working on this site, we found a lot of botanical remains and other objects which clearly reveal about the aesthetic understanding of the people. We also found certain rare millets and also pulses and cereals. Another important aspect is there are many Neolithic sites in this area. They are not visible. People generally go for the megalithic burials because megalithic burials are highly visible. The Neolithic people buried their dead within their residential area. We also have pit dwelling like storage structures. We found 3 burials in this area. In 2024, we found another 3 burials. We have not completely excavated that. So it very clearly indicates that these Neolithic people had moved into Tamil Nadu region. Our research has extended the limit from Salem and Krishnagiri down to Coimbatore. Actually, we need to do extensive research in India. Only when we reconstruct the village history, each and every village has to be surveyed. There is an archaeological record lying underneath, which we can identify by looking at the place name, places like Budihal and suffixes such as, in Tamil, Kotai, Nattam, Medu. They are good indicators of early settlement. So because of the urban development, many of the sites have been, destroyed. Even around Bangalore, Coimbatore, Chennai, many of the megalithic burials have they are completely gone. So it is the responsibility of, our younger generation to reconstruct the village history. Only when we go for field work, we can reconstruct the history in detail. That's what we did with our students from 2019 to 2024. Then we could extend the southern boundary of the southern Neolithic culture, which was considered to be around Payambali, very close to Krishnagiri, to another 200 kilometer further south. This is one of the research that I have undertaken in this area. People often complain there are no sites because we have not completely explored the Indian landscape. Sometimes people look for either Kumari Kandam in the Kanyakumari and beyond the sea. Sometimes they go for Indus Valley. This is what I tell them, that there is archaeological remain underneath your feet, and underneath each and every village. Only when we undertake a systematic and village to village survey, we can reconstruct our Indian history more scientifically. Rather than to rely on oral tradition and literary texts alone, we need to look at the material culture. This is where archaeology comes to the forefront. Yes.
It's very interesting because you mentioned the term Southern Neolithic. There is the contemporary around the same time period in Burzahom where we do find megaliths as well, and we'll be talking about megaliths now, around the same time period. The time scale is almost similar to Southern Neolithic as well. So you've spoken already, you mentioned megaliths burial. I want to take it to you, Dr. Menon. What are megaliths?
Okay, that's a good place to start with. Well, the word megalith basically comes from 2 Greek words. One is megathos, the scale of the undertaking, that is very large in scale, and lithoi, which means the material, which is stone. So basically it means built of large stones. Though today we know that all megaliths are not mega, in the sense they're not very big. And some of them not even lith, in the sense that they're not even built of stones. I'll come to that if we have time towards the end. But initially when early antiquarians and early archaeologists were looking at megaliths, it was a large thing which stood out in the landscape, which attracted them, which is what gave the name. And today, though we know that other expressions of the same cultural trait did not involve the use of large stones, we still continue with the term because of historical reasons to use the word megaliths. Okay, so do we have pictures? Yeah. This is the one, right? Yeah. Okay, fine. So yeah, so I'll just start off with the thing that my colleagues are telling you about how in the Neolithic, the preceding Neolithic, people were buried within the dwellings in which they were living. So you might have granddad buried under the living room or something like that. But in the subsequent Iron Age, around that time, I won't say exactly at that time, but you see the emergence of a separate graveyard. So there's an area, so there's a living area, which is the habitation site, and then you see the emergence of a separate area where the dead are relegated to. And then also they came up with this bewildering variety of surface markers of stone, mostly stone. So these are what becomes the megalith. Simplest megalith is what you see here. It's called a menhir. Okay, menhir must be very familiar to all of you who know obelisk, that menhir delivery man. So it's basically just a simple stone, an erect stone. Or it might sometimes even be an unmodified boulder which is marking a spot, usually a burial. So if you dig under a menhir, you might find a urn containing secondary burial. That is after you bury somebody, you take out the skull and the long bones or sometimes bone fragments and then put it in a pot and bury it under the thing. So so a menhir is a place which marks a spot, usually that of a burial. And yeah, this is another, okay, what I showed, how do you go back this one, right? Yeah, so this is, this is one megalith is really mega because this is at a place called Nilaskal in southern Karnataka, close to Hosnagara. So this particular menhir is about 6 meters high and about 3 meters wide at the base. And it's just about, 35 to 40 centimeters thick. So even quarrying such a large piece of stone is a wonderful, engineering achievement. And then this is oriented exactly north-south. We'll come to that towards the end again if you have time. So yeah, I'll just show you some more examples of menhirs. So menhirs can occur singly, like in, like these, or it can be in groups. So I think we'll have some examples of that. Yeah, so this is, Disha was telling you about megaliths being largely confined to the peninsula part of India, which is mostly true, but then there are other smaller pockets which exist outside that also. This is in Kutch, where you have menhirs like this, or in this case, a couple of them together. You also have, across the Korisettar's area, the Sanganakal area, you have a Neolithic phase, and you also have the later megalithic expression where there is an avenue or a series of menhirs kept in a row, which you can see here. This is another view of the same thing at Sanganakallu. Yeah, this is what Bursahom, what Disha was mentioning. This is in Kashmir, very close to Srinagar. You have this, and if I'm right, this is during the Neolithic itself?
Yeah, Neolithic.
Yes, and you have this huge stone. So it could be later. It could, so these are very distinctly, the stones, I mean, basically they are also erect. They were erect stones at one point of time. Now they're leaning or fallen. But these again are menhirs arranged in a sort of a semicircular pattern initially. Yeah, then you have mysterious monuments like these. This one is at a place called Hanam Sagar in northern Karnataka, where there's a sort of a plain which is enclosed on three sides by low hills, ringed by low hills. And only from the southern side you have entry into this valley-like thing. And you have a mysterious grid of stones. There are about 2,500 and upwards of stones arranged in a sort of a staggered grid. Nobody knows what the purpose was. There are no burials here. And there have been all kinds of conjectures. Maybe they were used to, like a calendar device, to chart time and stuff like that. But the sad part is that before we could investigate these, recently, all these stones have been removed by the farmers who are working there. So before you understand what this thing looks like, there's another picture I think I have of it. You can see that they are more or less like a grid. In the middle, you see a small portion which is disturbed by agricultural activities, and now the entire thing is gone, so we don't know what it was like. So these are called stone alignments. This is another picture on the ground of the same stone alignment, Hanam Sagar. Yeah, then you have stone circles. So why I'm trying to show you all these things is that even though you call it under one umbrella term called megalith, they have wide variety of forms actually. You saw a simple erect stone like a menhir, then you have stone circles like these which ring sort of a burial. In the middle of it, you may have a stone-lined grave, which is called a cist, or it might be just a pit burial where you have a pit and you put the remains in it. Or you could have sarcophagi, like terracotta urns which have got human remains in them. So I'll just show you some stone circles. This is again a pocket of megalithism which is outside southern India, a pocket in Vidarbha region of Maharashtra. There's a site called Junapani where you have hundreds of stone circles on the landscape, large ones. And then you can have a cairn stone circle. A cairn, I'll just talk something about these terminologies. Most of them are European terms because they must have been regional terms in Brittany or some other place like that, which we have come into this literature here. We also have indigenous terms for many of these things. Like Professor Selvakumar has done a lot of work on what kind of names we have for these structures in our indigenous literature. So I think the way to go, there's a lot of confusion because of the terminology. What I call a dolmen or a cyst may not be what somebody else calls it. So there's a crying need to have a sort of uniform terminology. Maybe descriptive things like, when you say stone circle, it's rather obvious. So we'll try to look at some of the, so this one is a cairn stone circle. So you can see a cairn is nothing but a heap of stones and earth put together. And so to contain them is sometimes a bit of a difficult thing. So you have these large boulders kept around it. So it will be called a cairn stone circle. Okay, so And there's usually a burial in the middle of it. This is yet another cairns that you can see here. And this is the cairn at this Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary near Bilagirrangan Hills. You can see again the periphery, you have huge boulders containing the cairn material which is heaped in the center. And sometimes, when you need to make a large cairn and the heap just kind of dissipates due to gravity. So what you do is you either place large boulders around the periphery containing them, or in this case you have slabs driven into the ground so that they don't shift, and then you heap the cairn in the middle. And yeah, this is another slab circle, stone laterite slabs, I think, near a place called Anakara. And then we come to dolmens. Now the word basically means table stones. So they look like little tables, or they look like stone huts, you could call them. So this is at a very spectacular megalithic site called Hirebenakal. Fortunately, it still survives, north of Hampi. Everyone goes to Hampi, but a couple of ridges to the north, you have this place called Hirebenakal, where you have hundreds of these large dolmens. So these are other dolmens in the high ranges near Kerala, like from starting with Marayur and going into Kodaikanal area. You have these kind of dolmens which are surrounded by stone masonry which contains them. This is another view of the same kind of structures, dolmens in high range of Kerala. And this is yet again, you can see the sort of stone masonry which contains them. So this is again what a dolmen looks like. Dolmen is basically just slabs kept on end and a large heavy capstone kept on top of it, making a sort of enclosure within which they might have had urns in which there were human remains, or sometimes the human remains are just scattered in the floor of the dolmen. Yeah, these are dolmens with this, there's openings which are called portholes, because many of them were circular like a ship's portholes. And this one has got U-shaped portholes, and through which maybe votive offerings were inserted at periodic dates to honor the dead. Yeah, and these are some, those of you are from Bangalore, if you just go down towards Tamil Nadu, into Hosur and beyond, towards Krishnagiri, there's a spectacle, again, as spectacular as Hirebenakal is, a site called Mallasandram, and this is one of the dolmens in Mallasandram. You can see the circular porthole there. Okay, this is another impressive dolmen. So one thing about megaliths is that they are the earliest surviving monuments from archaeological history. There might have been earlier monuments built of perishable materials which haven't survived, but when you think of South India, usually the architecture that comes to mind is a spectacular temple, which are very sculpturesque and richly worked on. But behind all of them, long before the first temple or even the stupa, Buddhist stupa was erected on the soil, denizens here were erecting monuments out of stone, which looked crude like these, but they contained the seed of architecture, which later became spectacular monuments like your southern Indian temples. Yeah, this one, for example, it shows you how you have a dolmen in the center, and all around, this again is in Mallasandram, and you have a ring of stones, closely fitted stone slabs around and then they have heaped, like you can see in this corner here, they have heaped rubble to make it look like a little bit of a dome. So if you look at it, this is nothing but a stupa actually, isn't it? What you have around is the drum of the stupa and the anda, or the hemispherical dome, and the center you have a relic chamber which contains remains of dead people. So somewhere, like I was telling you, that these crude monuments contain the seed of later architecture. This is one very good example. I would call this a proto-stupa. So yeah,
This is from Brahmagiri.
Yeah, this is from Brahmagiri, I think Veela's pictures.
Veela's picture,
so
yeah.
Beautifully excavated cyst burial. So this is what is below the ground. On the top of the ground, you would have seen only a circle of stone. But when Veela dug below, he sees that, so you see that the stones are kept in a funny arrangement. So they're projecting on it's called a swastika arrangement. So it's so that it cannot collapse inwards. So they kept it, if you just keep it touching each other, it can collapse inwards. And this masonry kept all around it so that it cannot collapse outwards. So they made a very stable chamber within which they can keep the remains of the dead people. And you can also see the porthole on the slab there on the top.
Yeah, I'll stop you here. I'll come to you, Professor. Dr. Menon took us through varieties, typologies of megaliths. So megaliths are not just of one kind, they are varieties of megaliths, as we can see on the screen. I want to ask you, how they were constructed, because as Professor Korisettar just pointed out, the timeline of Neolithic is also about 3000 and early, about little bit 4 to 3000 if I'm not wrong, 3000 BCE.
3000,
Yeah, and all the
1200.
way later and merges into Iron Age. Now I want you to tell me the chronology of megaliths. Where do we fit megaliths? Because your writing suggests that they are part of the Iron Age complex. But you also hints in a lot of your papers that it could be a little early. They could be an antecedent to the tradition of megaliths. And why were they built? Why would they build? Were they commemorative? And you've mentioned about burials. Were all burials? Could you just throw some light on it?
Actually, as far as this megalithic burial tradition is concerned, we have antecedent evidence right from the Neolithic period. Even at the Harappan site of Dholavira, there are certain burials which show some
very similar to the
incipient
Brahma
stages. Deccan Chalcolithic, we have urn burials. Neolithic period also, we have pit burial, sarcophagus, and some of these stone association and the antecedent or incipient development is seen in the Chalcolithic and also late Harappan. And culture, actually, the tradition of erecting burial is common across the world, right from the Mesolithic or even in the Middle Paleolithic, people have associated some of the remains with Neanderthals. But they became very prominent right from the Mesolithic period. As far as southern India is concerned, we have this monument building developing somewhere in the middle of the second millennium BC. And there is some overlap between the late Neolithic and Iron Age, and it continues in the early historic period where we have early Tamil texts. We have clear references to the burial tradition in the early Tamil texts. We have names of these burials mentioned as Karpadukai and Thari, which refers to urn burial. Karthittai Nedungal, the Nattapolum Nada Nedungal, there is a reference, but this particular reference speaks about a natural stone. But this Nedungal, Nattukal, there are many villages near Coimbatore which are known as Nattukal Palayam. If you go to that village, looking at the place name, you will identify a megalithic burial site. In Kerala, there is a village with the name Kodakkal. You can search it on Wikipedia, Wiki map, or a Google map, and you go to the village, you will find an archaeological site. Sometimes we identify archaeological site by looking at these names. Actually, their timeline is roughly middle of the second millennium BC, say around 1500 BC, down to 500 CE. And some of them were constructed in the later period also. In the Nilgiris, they have found a Constantine Roman coin. That means some of the communities living in the Nilgiris area, they were building them even after 1st century CE. And we have a continuing megalithic tradition among some of the communities of the Western Ghats. Even in central India, we have different forms of megaliths in northeastern India, in certain regions of Orissa. And some of the communities of Western Ghats in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, still they construct such a tradition. Even among Kurubas in near Bangalore, Karnataka region, they used to raise some kind of structure which indicates some similarity with this megalithic burial tradition. So these burials are commonly found all across southern India. But recently in Tamil Nadu, they have got a dating of 3300 for iron from a megalithic burial. But that is just starting of a new phase of research. We need to undertake further research. Even from Brahmagiri, Kathleen Morrison has a date of 2000 BCE for iron. So current understanding tells us definitely these megalithic burials date from middle of the second millennium BC, 1500 and down to 500 CE or a later period. We also have clear references in the early Tamil texts. We also have references in the medieval inscription. They refer to Kalasakadu. Kalasa means vessel, and also Kurakku Pattadai. That is a term occurring in Narthamalai inscription of 11th to 12th century. So people had the knowledge of these burials, and people attributed to this popular story saying that at old age in ancient time, people became very dwarf, like very small, and they were placed in
Dwarf
a kind of
houses.
jar with food and water and everything, and they will bury them alive. That is why they are known as Madamatakka Salu or Mudumakkal Tadi. Mudumakkal means an old person or old people. Tadi means an urn, a buried urn. So this kind of traditions are very common among the local people. But when we excavate, we don't find any complete skeleton except in few cases. And these burials were erected much after
So the
the
secondary
death.
burial? So they
Yes,
were
secondary burials. They probably collect the bones and then they bury them after certain period. They are also known as, padai, Peringar padai in Tamil they call it. The term padai is very important. It is associated with ancestor worship. Even when today, when they are offering to the temple or any kind of worship at home, they say padai, offer worship. And another term involved here is kadavul, which is a Tamil term to refer to God. One of the scholars has suggested the burial places are known as kadu. Kadu means the place of the nature or place for the dead. They are known as idugadu or sudugadu. Sudu means where people are cremated, dead body is cremated. And the nadu is a place where people live, and they correlate with Janapata. Janapata, the place where people walk, and here nada means to walk, and then Nadu becomes a territory where people inhabit. This has been suggested by Sudarshan Sanavi Ratne. And here they have a clear categorization of a Nadu, the living space, and then Kadu, the dead people's place. From the Neolithic people buried the dead bodies within their residential area, but in the Iron Age, they had distinct space for the dead and space for the living, which is known as Idugadu or Sudugadu. The same tradition also occurs in Tamil texts of Silappadigaram and Manimegalai, which talks about Suduga Vendro, Iduga Vendro. There is another interesting tradition mentioned where the dead body is laid open to the natural elements, like Parsis do and then bury in their Dokoma. So some of the scholars suggested immediately after the death, the body was exposed to the natural elements. After some time, they collect the bones and then created the megalithic burials. Megalithic burials also indicate a community effort. If you look at the megalithic burials, we find lot of iron objects. Some of them are really monumental. They built them in a huge size. Some of them are 6-7 feet tall. They have created a stone chamber, and then there is a front chamber, and then there is a passage. So they say that a person after dying, his or her spirit enters this. This is what they call kadavul, mean to pass inside. So from this, some people derive the name Kadavul to refer to God in Tamil as dead people's soul reaching inside the chamber. The porthole, which Srikumar Menon suggested, they say that that is meant for the soul to get in or to come out. And that is one concept, one interpretation. We do not know how far it is accurate. These are all simply interpretation. But interestingly, the dead people were worshipped, and also the entire community was involved in the burial ritual, where different people, the relatives and other people came and they created these burials. When you look at the burials, some of the burials are very rich. You find thousands of cornelian beads which are not locally available. These burials with cornelian beads are later in date. Similarly, burials with Shatavahana or Andhra ware or russet-coated painted ware, they are of later date. And this cornelian bead, the source material was probably obtained from Gujarat or Maharashtra, Central Indian region. And these burials with a lot of objects. Sometimes we also find gold object. Adichanallur, they have found diadems, gold diadems, and they have also found a lot of copper bronze objects. Very interesting design, and they are very similar right from Nagpur down to Kanyakumari region. So clearly, and the entire relatives of the dead people came and assembled for the death, and they could have contributed the grave goods. That is why we find these monumental building. These monuments also indicate changes in the socio-economic organization. Uday Ravi Murthy, who has published a book based on the material culture, and also Robert Brubaker and other scholars have suggested the megalithic society was organized as a chiefdom or ranked society in which there were different ranked groups. Probably the chiefs would have got more grave goods, and they are rich with a lot of artifacts. And also we have variation in size and dimension.
Yeah.
Some of them are sometime 10 or 15 meter in diameter. Sometimes we find only a very small urn with only one or two iron object, clearly indicating some kind of ranking. We cannot immediately use the concept of wealth as in the processual archaeologists suggested. There could be several factors like social network. Suppose if somebody, there may be some individuals celebrating their birthdays, only there will be 5 people. Maybe the person is of different nature. Some people who are more jovial, bigger social network may have 100 people. So in the same way, in the Iron Age, these burials could reflect the social network and the social ranking and the status of the people and the attitude of the people, not necessarily the wealth. So yes.
As you pointed out, that there has to be some practice that been put there for ritualistic practices like burying the remains of the dead, and there has to be some practice, and we see some similarities in some regions. There are also regional variations, but we'll come to that. But what I want to know is that getting these big blocks or slabs of stones to the site of burial, that too has to be there has to be a workforce dedicated to doing so, right? Because they're building these megaliths in large numbers. Some we don't find them now because of urbanization and otherwise, but if we calculate it, in southern India alone, you have the thickest concentration of megaliths. So there has to be some workforce dedicated to just do that.
Definitely. It is said that it is a community activity, not one or two individual. Lot of people. That's what I said. The social network of the person. Several people were involved. If you look at early Tamil literature, it also talks about the funerary rituals undertaken by certain group of people, and there are specialists who undertake these rituals. And then it says that Pulayan Eva Pulmel Amardundu. There is a reference which clearly indicates there are certain different group of people who were specialized in constructing these kinds of burials. Similarly, in Kerala, to excavate these rocket caves, there must have been some kind of people who are specialists. So clearly, we see changes in social organization during the Iron Age. We have a well-developed Iron Age society, which is also known as a heroic society, where you find a lot of swords, a lot of weapons of offense and defense. And these people had high level of competition for territorial fight and chief. That is why we say these people were, chiefdom level society. Although the concept of Elmon service, band, tribes, chiefdom, state is criticized, we can definitely suggest some kind of political organization developed, and these people had more fights for territory and cattle lifting. Sometime, if you look at Sangam literature, clearly it says that the menhirs, the tall stones, were erected mainly for the warriors. It is not necessary that each and every individual of the society got the megalithic burial. Sometimes certain types were probably meant for these heroes who fought for the village, fought to recover the cattle or defend the cattle and died. That is where the Nadukal or Virakal tradition of the later period. In the later period, we have a lot of viracals with sculptures, painting, and inscription. So the megaliths are, some of the megalithic types are prelude to the later day hero stone or viracal tradition, where we have sculptures and inscriptions in the later period. Definitely we should consider that some of the megalithic burials, especially menhirs, were erected for the dead heroes. As you suggested, definitely it involved some specialized groups, and also iron. Iron is one important factor in the making and carving of this
I
rock.
was coming to that because we were discussing, and I was asking you that what is the percentage of chisel mark that you find in these stones, and whether stone technology, they've used that or just iron alone.
Yeah, in
largely.
some of the contexts, I think they could have used the iron technology, especially laterite. In some area, even it is said, looking at the weak spots in the certain type of granitic rocks, they could easily cut using heat and non-iron tools. Some scholars have suggested. Professor Adiyaman from our department, he had undertaken some experimental studies. If they are undertaking such an approach, you will not find chisel mark. Yes.
Professor Korisettar.
Yeah, that's very much true. Even outskirts of Bangalore, I have seen some 20, 30 years ago when we were doing field work in this area, you see, fire setting was a most common practice amongst these wooders who used to remove slabs. You heap a lot of fuel on the boulder surface and then set it on fire at high temperatures and suddenly pour water. So this temperature contrast results in removing slabs. So that was much easier to remove slabs, or what we call orthostats, for constructing these megaliths. And it is not always true that megaliths are coeval with the beginning of Iron Age and so on. Given this type of technology, which antedates the use of chisel, iron objects and so on. And then this monumentalization is not peculiar to Iron Age and post-Iron Age time period, because we see as early as 3000 BC, the Neolithic pastoral communities were also constructing monuments. We call them herder monuments, we call them ash mounds, and so many other names. But they're simply heaping on an artificial surface, leveled surface, sometimes to create a platform and then begin accumulating cattle dung, including sheep, goat, and so on. And there were occasions when they will come to this particular identified or designated place and perform some rituals. I'm not getting to the details of what type of rituals and so on. Most of the rituals associated with early agricultural communities and later Iron Age communities were all fertility rituals. Definitely associated fertility cults. And then they were performing this because bull played a very, very important role in the emergence of agricultural way of life. It is a male fertility deity. All over southern India or anywhere in the context of early Neolithic, you come across a bull in the form of imageries or in the form of terracotta figurines. They are votive bulls, which could be worshipped on every day in the household itself. Because bull becomes a symbol, and this we see that bull emerging as a male fertility deity going back to nearly 14,000 years ago in Southwestern Asia. So there's a lot of these links between Southwestern Asian early developments. Archaeologists have also excavated sanctuaries, domestic sanctuaries, where these bulls were also worshipped and things like that. So Mother Goddess has been there for more than 40, 50,000 years among our ancestors, but the bull begins to appear after the Neolithic. This transition is marked by the worship of bull as a male fertility. And in that context, the Mother Goddess and bull are considered mother and child context, and that is where the fertility is implied. And we see that happening in the archaeological context, not only in the Indus Valley civilization, which is actually, these figurines are looked at from the independent of all other related artifacts. They are looked at as toys, they are looked at as terracotta objects and things like that, but they have a place in the ritual practices performed by these people, not only in an urbanized context in the Indus Valley civilization, but also here. But what we see, the pastoral communities, they were dependent on seasonal availability of these wild food grains. So they would be nomadic, even though they were pastoralists. And they would also be moving with their livestock into those areas where seasonal pasture was available. So now, if you look at the present day landscape, we think that this has remained the same. It was 5,000 years ago. But as we understand what we call paleoclimatology, we look at the changes in the landscape. We look at the kind of modifications of the landscape that have been caused by human interference and so on. So we go back in time. We have to look at a landscape which was very, very different from what we see today. So pasture lands were most abundant, and groundwater resources were even more abundant because now water table has gone by several hundred feet below. But you go back 5,000 years ago, Or even go back 100 years ago, at the base of many of these hills in and around Tumkur, Bangalore, or come up to Sanganakalu, active springs were there. Why springs were there? Because groundwater was not depleting. It was actually recharging beyond the capability of the subsurface to hold water resources. So it used to come out in the form of springs, and then there were these landscapes which were swampy, on all around the hills, where on top of these hills, these Neolithic sites were located. So this cattle keeping economy was flourishing in those days. And then they identified certain locales in the landscape where they could create a platform and periodically return to this particular place, accumulate and perform these rituals in the presence of fire, a sort of fire cult we see. And this resulted in the formation of huge monuments. We call them ash mounds. They were first discovered in 1802 by one Colin Mackenzie, the first Surveyor General of India. Since then, several hundred of them were found across. So they have a long time span of this practice, beginning from about 3000 BC to till about 1200 BC. We have dated each one of them, and some are very massive, large ones, some are intermediate, some are very small. They have their own life histories. So these also give us an idea that there were these pastoral communities, performing these activities with a definite purpose and a belief system governing, the formation of these kind of monuments. So monumentalization is not associated with the first urban economies, urban societies, and so on. So they have their antecedents of nearly 2,000 to 3,000 years before the emergence of these cities and so on. And then when it comes to these objects of ornament, he was referring to Kodumanal site where you have shell beads and so on. We have dated these objects of ornament, beads, stone beads and shell beads, going back to 15,000 years ago. So this we call as a behavioral modernity in our ancestors and so on. In some areas it is as early as 20,000 years, in some areas it is 40,000 years, even earlier and so on. It go for Africa, there are 80, 90,000 years ago. This evidence for behavioral modernity has been recorded and so on.
Yeah. Thank you so much for putting that, because I too believe that megalithic tradition sort of begins little early on, somewhere in Neolithic period. And as we are conducting rigorous research, I think evidence, because there are a lot of habitation sites have been excavated in recent years, so probably sooner or later we'll get more evidence. Now, we don't have time to go into more questions, but I'll open it for audience if there are more. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just had a very basic question to Dr. Menon. As you mentioned that in the types of megaliths, there's one type known as the stone circles. So, how do you identify how one stone circle can be classified as a megalith? Because the type of boulders as shown in the pictures were very basic. As in, I myself have seen a lot of boulders just lying across one of the, I don't know, a mosque type area in my locality. So, what is the basis for the classification?
It's a very good question, because something which many archaeologists also have difficulty with sometimes. Like you said, it's very basic, and most of these are unmodified field boulders. So they just bring it around. Most of these things, to answer your question also about where they brought the materials from, many megaliths are very locally sourced materials. So right from there, they take it and arrange it in a circle. So technically, unless you dig and find something associated with it, you can't talk about that. But usually, the size of the boulders that are involved are pretty large, and it takes some effort to put them into a circle.
Also, there has to be some pattern. You'll have to, they won't be randomly lying. They will
You will
be
see them as a perfect circle. If you look at a drone map, you can see that circles and design.
And
they are not random.
They're usually not just singly placed, so there'll be clusters of them.
Clusters. Sometimes you will find pottery from some of the burials, dugout area. So we look at multiple evidence from existing as well as already excavation have been done in similar kind circles. We have parallels. So we look at multiple evidence to identify that as a stone circle.
Maybe you have seen them scattered here and there. Perhaps they were all together at one time, and people now modern day, human activity must have dispersed them from their original place. That is also a possibility. Because this entire landscape is full of these megalithic complexes, burial complexes.
And I think one of the things that we learn in archaeology is to pick up patterns. And that's the eye of that's what training does. And with the stone tools also, if you randomly go and pick up stones, it'll be difficult for, without training to identify whether they were stone tools or just randomly picking up unfaceted, stones. So yeah.
Another pattern also happens sometime what farmers do whenever they want to cultivate, if there is a stone circle, they collect all the stones around and they put it within the stone circle. So remodify the design of the original again
So they'll
circle.
create
Some
a
of the
heap.
photos showed that. So
Yeah.
farmers to cultivate, they need a field without stone. So
Yeah.
they reinforce the old megaliths.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Another question. Yeah.
Aruni,
I,
Dr.
I just had a follow-up question to the previous question. So, because we find these stone circles in even in mundane sight, as she said, how does that comment on how many megaliths to be expected to be found in India? Like, is
There are
does it
thousands of it. They
No.
span.
Numbers
There's
we
no number.
cannot
We
predict.
can't
It
predict.
depends on
Sometime-
the size of the burial complex.
Yeah.
Sometimes
and
you
the
may
commonly.
find only 2 or 3. Sometimes megaliths sometimes are built by the nomadic communities. It is said. In such case, you will find few numbers. Some of the burial sites they have more than 1,000. I know many sites where they have huge areas where thousands of burials.
Like
And
for
these-
example, Hirebankal, he was
Yeah.
showing that on top of the hill there are hundreds of them.
Hundreds.
But if you go to site like Benhir,
Hanamsagar.
Neelaskal, it's isolated Benhir.
Isolated.
So
sometimes.
you know as an archaeologist what it could be and
Yeah,
what it
yeah.
is. So that's right.
And with Hirambenical, they were initially when they were identified, they were called as dwarf houses. Yeah. It was later.
Moriyara Mane. something.
Even now in Allegri, they say that earlier they were dwarf people.
Dwarf
They
people,
were
yeah.
using it for. There are so many local traditions.
They'll say Pandavara Mane,
this actually
Moriyara
is-
Mane, things like that.
This actually is not a local tradition. It's all over South India actually.
Also-
That's the story.
Also, yeah.
The details, names may change. Moriyaramane may be called something else in Kerala, and something,
Kerala.
but they all talk about this dwarf people,
Yeah.
mainly because the portholes are small.
This is part of cultural landscape construction. Sometimes they bring Ramayana and Mahabharata stories onto that. I have seen in both in Kerala, Wayanad and Kanyakumari, where Tadaga is identified with some of the hill forms. So the literary motifs are taken to interpret the landscapes, cultural landscape
The
construction.
archaeological feature and the mythology are diachronic.
Yeah,
There is no
they are.
direct relationship. It's
Yes.
a belief system among the contemporary
And-
villages.
It's a later construction.
Also to tell you that megaliths are found as it was shown from Kashmir to the southern tip, even in northeast, and as shown by Dr. Menon in Gujarat. So you can see there is a spread of megalithic traditions, which are burial traditions, also commemorative. Also in some
Yes,
natures,
yes,
there
commemorative.
are no bones, so they're commemorative, and that sort of what Professor Selvakumar also said later on evolves into hero stones and other, and also cenotaphs in medieval
Yeah.
period, the Rajput cenotaphs, and even
I have seen one menhir converted by the Rashtrakutas into a hero stone in Bellary area.
yeah,
Yeah,
there's also
okay.
that. So communities have also interacted over the years with megaliths, the local communities. Yeah. So another question. So
In the front.
I'll pass it on to him next.
yeah, please do that.
Okay, so thank you for this great session. So my question may not directly be related to your presentation, but so what we have noticed in the past few years is that there's a lot of focus that we see ASI being involved in surveying of old religious structures and the government pushing towards it. A lot of our politicians talking about reclaiming religious structures. So how is that going to affect Indian society and Indian historiography?
Who's going to answer that?
You have an answer yourself. We don't have to answer the question because
It's
it's
much more complex.
we don't like to involve in politicized archaeology.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's
Generally,
very easy to understand. There are agendas, and agendas, the people who are holding the agenda, if they are in power, they advocate. That is the only reason you are looking at it presently.
Yeah, national politics is bound to influence all kinds of cultural academic practices. That's what
Yeah,
we can say.
that's an ongoing sort of a thing. There's no right answer to that question, I think.
Maybe there's
Absolutely.
you can say that nobody wants to reclaim megaliths. Maybe because they're
nobody-
not very
so
glamorous.
I recently wrote a like
No,
just
if you want to establish Mahabharata was
Yeah,
the
then
locale
you
here,
may-
all these Pandukals are all Mahabharata structures.
So
only.
so I've written a column on megaliths recently, and I started by saying that everybody wants to go to Stonehenge at least once. It must be in your bucket list. But here we have our very own Stonehenge spread across the country. And some, I think you were telling me this, there's one megalith site near Bangalore.
Yeah, that is Malasandaram.
Yeah,
No,
Right.
no,
so-
Devanhalli itself was a megalithic
Yeah,
burial
so-
complex.
In
Now
fact,
they
in-
removed all the megaliths to create
Yeah,
a
yeah, all
No,
the
but
tarmac.
still are. If you go to Bannerghatta National Park, not in the tourism area, but there are plenty of megaliths in
Yeah.
Bannerghatta. They still survive, because it's a protected area.
So we are advocating the things politicians are not. So, yeah, please.
Aruni, Dr. Aruni was asking.
After that, you can pass on to there are. At
Thank you,
back.
sir. Just because I'm just recently last 2-3 weeks, I think we are all seeing the even frontline cover the Iron Age in Tamil Nadu, and also you people had an Disha was also part of the one discussions on the recent works on the Iron Age and particularly claiming of the Iron Age in Tamil Nadu. So I thought you would be discussing about this also. So what is the latest? If suppose the 3000 BC, and then what will be the situating the sites in Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka? What could be the dates of the Neolithic or Iron Age in Karnataka?
Actually, see, recently they have just come out with the announcement and they have not published in detail. But that is something interesting. I think this announcement makes an important point that we have been always looking at Indus Valley civilization and other things. So the other part of India also had different kind of cultural formation. I think we need to do research more.
on it.
They have reported the finding from one site. So if we find in several other sites similar dates and evidence, we'll be able to, tell more clearly. But I think this finding is very important. We need to undertake more research, coming from several other sites. Professor Korisettar will be able to
Yeah,
comment.
what we have found is this linearity from Neolithic to Chalcolithic to Bronze Age or Iron Age is not applicable to all parts, all cultural areas. There may be regional variation in which people responded to the needs of the time. So the resource availability is one thing, and human resource was always available, but if other alternative metal resources were not available, they would go in for the immediately available.
Yeah.
But as we understand, megalithic people, I mean, if you come to the kind of absolute timescales we have established for the Neolithic in the northern part of this region where they have found the oldest iron object, it is not older than about 1200 BC.
Yeah, yeah.
So this regional variation we see, it's not that only iron appears independent of other cultural, manifestations. We have to look at that. This is an indication that there is a possibility of regional variation in the way in which these technologies developed in prehistoric period. So we have to look at it more carefully. And the publicity that it has gained is for a different purpose altogether. And it is essential also to counter one publicity against another publicity. We need this kind of statements to be made. But the dates that have been obtained for the material from the sites of Sivagalai and all are absolutely authentic and secure dates. What we need is to establish the pattern wherein we have
Yes.
number of sites
Number of-
giving more or less same kind of timeline for the iron objects in the context of southern Tamil Nadu. So it
This-
need not apply to the entire peninsular South India.
Yeah, this is what I also sometimes say that C.J. Thompson's 3H system, how it can
it's
be
not
looked at
applicable.
using indigenous epistemology, especially the Tolkapiam's concept of, five Thinais coexisting in the early historic period. It is not necessary that every culture has to undergo megalithic and the Neolithic.
Yeah, yeah.
So this uneven forms of cultural development, even today, you go to central India and any other area, you have different forms of cultures. From Bombay, far away, 40, 50 kilometer, you have different communities living. So we need to relook at these models of cultural development and
Yeah.
multilinearity of cultural development.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's what we began a conversation that there is absolute no linear progression. We'll take one last question. Yeah.
Yeah, hello, good evening. You mentioned Stonehenge. When I saw the stone circles, I was curious whether there's any connection between these stone circles and Stonehenge. And
They are of the same practice. See, the human beings have a way of connecting, even though we live miles apart. Even they are megalithic structures, so are these. But there's no direct correlation. It's like, you have stone hand axes here and you have hand axes in Africa. But that's the way early humans have created.
so was there any
tools.
connection between the people there and here
No,
and that
no,
time?
Doesn't look like that.
Connected.
Yeah.
People are always
Mentally
connected,
they
but
are
there are the different ways in which they were getting connected with each other. But he will have a better answer for your question.
It's about the astronomical part. We didn't have time to cover that part or whatever. So we're trying to see whether there are any consistent orientation practices among dolmen. Do they all face cardinal east or cardinal west? So the conclusion that we come to after a lot of studies is that there's no consistent practice across the subcontinent. Like for example, if you look at Mallasandram, all the dolmens face, their portholes face exact east. Whereas a site like in Aihole, Meguti Hill, they're all over the compass. Okay, they don't have any particular. But there is one particular, one series of sites in near Nilaskal and Baise in near Hosnagara, where you have a series of menhirs. They're built on a small, slight incline toward, which slopes up towards the west, and they are designed such that pairs of menhirs frame the setting sun during the longest and shortest days of the year. So we don't know what this meant to the people who erected them. You know that it's intentional, but maybe it is some kind of a belief system which associated with the cult of the dead, which involved the sun also.
In short, there also there's a chronological gap as well. We can discuss maybe later. I think it's time to.
Just wondering one more
One
thing.
small comment.
So are the archaeologists working on Stonehenge, are they in contact with you or other Indian archaeologists?
It's well established what your Stonehenge is. It's not a burial monument, whereas Taj Mahal is a burial monument.
So
Taj Mahal is a burial monument, whereas Stonehenge was not a burial monument.
So there is a connect, it's a practice that has been followed for a different reasons.
Thank you.
Stonehenge is only one monument. There are plenty of stone circles in Britain.
Thank you so much for this wonderful session. Archaeology, fascinating subject, covered huge ground, digging and dating, all sorts of things, that's happening in the world of archaeology. Thank you so much again for a wonderful overview. I think most of this audience is not definitely in the field of archaeology, and that's the whole idea of this History Literature Festival, is to give the sense, give the curiosity which is out here, and convey it to a greater audience. I think the session started with that saying, is archaeology just stones and more stones? What it seems like it's research and more research, and I think that's a good way to kind of take it forward. May I invite Professor Rakesh Pasand to give the mementos to our speakers. Thank you so much.